let's apply what we've learned to a breakout activity, another fun one. So I have all the directions in the agenda, or actually in the slides attached to the agenda. And what we're going to do, we're going to take a look at a fictitious scenario. And maybe it's something that you've actually faced here at GitLab. You're a new manager and you have 7 direct reports. And the team was created after a new field department was stood up at GitLab to penetrate a new market. Everyone comes to the team from a different location and no one has worked together before. And there have been no team building activities to date. And the team needs to break into a new industry to start selling GitLab, and the demands on forecast and pipeline are really high. So using the model and your knowledge of management best practices, what can you do to achieve and sustain high performance with the teams you now lead? So this is what you're going to do. You're going to plot activities through stages 1 through 4 with your team to move them up through high performance. So the first half, we're just going to focus on stages 1 through 4. And you could write 1 to 3 different activities that you would do to lead your team to high performance. So what would you do to build trust? What would you do to orientate your team? What would you do to goal clarify? And again, applying your field, your knowledge, your understanding of management best practices. So we'll come back, we'll do stages 1 through 4, and then we'll do 5 through 7 later today. And there is an example on slide 14. You could feel free to take a few tips from there as well. Welcome back. Welcome back. Hopefully there was lively discussions in the breakout groups. I saw a couple of groups went ahead and started populating stages 5 through 7. So kudos to you. It sounds like there were some good ideas generating and you didn't want to lose them. So David, I know you had a couple of questions for the group. Anything top of mind?
I guess just to kind of kick it off, I'd love perspective, a couple of people to chime in. Hey, what did you find easy and or hard about this exercise? Where in your discussions did you get stuck and why?
I think part of number 1, orientation, and number 2, trust building. There are these moments where I feel like those get switched either in practice or in habit, where we put together a new team or we take over a new team, and it's really important that we learn who everybody is and what their objectives are and their background and sort of create that pairing. And I think Jack said it best on our call when he said it actually makes sense to define the why first, to sort of say, why are we all here? Why did we end up in this place? And then around that, they're going to hopefully coalesce around the next couple of steps versus, hey, let's get to know each other first, which I think is kind of a natural human characteristic. So these 2 and 1 being a little bit out of order in my small brain actually is a good thing.
Thank you, Tim. Other thoughts? Other groups? Where did you have some stall in the conversation?
We had a little bit of stall trying to discern the difference between 4 and 5 a little bit, and having to go back over notes and try to remember. Commitment seems, like buy-in and some of that, but there's process development happening throughout most likely. And so I think the exact time to really focus on process implementation was a little fuzzy. But I think also Joel gave a great example of his role. He was sort of brought into an existing team, and so he had to take a team that was already functioning and go back to the beginning and do some of these things.
I noticed, Patrick, as well, in your group, you had motivational with commitment under stage 4. I'm curious to hear more about that.
There wasn't a lot of discussion about it. That was just a thought I had. I think it's important once you sort of say who we are and why we're here, to then get everybody moving in the same direction. And I think you've got basic goal clarification, you have a basic North Star, and it's really about getting momentum and then work out the processes along the way.
Awesome.
Let's dig into the building trust part. What were some good examples that you all shared with each other of tactics, activities to build trust with your teams?
Tim was nice enough to tell me about how when new reps join, they often do a mini QBR during their QBRs. And I thought that was a great way of saying, oh, awesome. That's how they're going to have to do that anyway. If it's a brand new team with 7 new people, have them do that and have the mini QBR to each other to kind of get out of the way of here's who we are, here's what I know, and that, you know, how we're going to slot into the team and that you can depend on them. And to me, that's the start of trust there.
Thank you, Jack.
I think this was Joel's suggestion in our team. He brought up giving an example of transparency and honesty to show your team that, hey, this is who I am, and I'm going to share with you, and therefore I hope you'll feel comfortable doing the same.
Good, yeah, and vulnerability, right, going along
Yes.
with that. Yep.
Exactly the word.
We borrowed this from the template, but I'm not ashamed of it because I think it's a great one. Establish team ground rules and attend the DIB training together as a team.
How many of you have kind of some ground rules or working norms within your team? About half, maybe a little more than half. Right. How did you go about establishing those team norms?
I think for PS, because, well, we all work with customers, there's that tendency to be always on, right? So I encourage people to set their boundaries, and by setting boundaries, it's really more about sharing, right? I'm going to be available. Here's my block, generally speaking, and here's my emergency button, you know, and I just be open and honest about that. Then there's no, where is that person? And I can't get a hold of them, and like, just make it easy.
I created an event for us, which was me joining the company as an opportunity to say, hey, let's define who we want to be in SMB Americas. We didn't call them values because of messy foo, but let's define the statements that we want to stand by. And then what are the 3 to 4 things that we're going to hold ourselves accountable to, right? Which we came up with 3, which are all in all the time. Protect the person to your right, which means protect the customer first, company second, all the way down to self last. And then be the best that you can possibly be at all times. So it doesn't mean be the best. You don't have to show up and be an A+ student, right? If you're sick with the flu that day, your best might be very different than your absolute best day. And that's been a really easy way for us to hold ourselves accountable to making sure that we do the right things. And it started with, where it started with was me joining and saying, we've never done this before. So why don't we come together as a group and really hash out what we want to be?
I love that, Nick.
Thanks.
I also find it interesting that, Nick, you joining, you were able to diagnose that had not been done. Sort of like, what's our identity? And people sort of saying, well, we just kind of do our thing. And you seeing that need to sort of pull things up and sort of provide that narrative or that mission statement. That's huge. Thanks for doing that.
So did you have any things, Nick, that you observed that led you to think, hey, we need to kind of take a step back here? Any things you observed that kind of led you to that?
So the first week, the beauty of being the new person is you get to do, I don't know what I don't know. So tell me everything, whether you want to or not, right? So for me, it started with just doing shadows and sitting with them and saying, hey, I don't know anything about your role. And the only way I'm going to be able to support you in doing your role is if I understand it better. So it gave me an opportunity to shadow the ASMs and figure out how they're caring about their day-to-day, which gave me a really quick opportunity to realize like the level of granularity and process and how they just handled the kind of the core functions of their job. And then from there, and I'll give a specific example, it went into just a massive Q&A. So for example, shadowing one of the ASMs and watching how they conducted a team meeting in a one-on-one, being able to diagnose really quickly, like the level of process that happened in those 2 things, or lack of process that happened, right? Not bad or good, just lack of process. It allowed me to figure out like, okay, well, why do you do it that way? And what's the ultimate goal of this one-on-one? Is it just a standing recurring meeting, or is there a bigger purpose behind it? And I feel like once I was able to get to the bottom of those, answer those questions, gave me a really good feeling on, okay, this is kind of the degree that we've thought about these bigger items. Like, what do we want SMB to look like at the end of this year or next year? How do we contribute to the overall organization? Like, what are the things that are really expected of us to be successful? And that was a natural segue into having that. We did a 1.5-day workshop. So we did 2 working sessions for about a half day. And it started out with like, what are our values, right? Or what are the statements that we want to stand by? And then it turned into what's the mission we want to do as a group. And then from there, it's what are the things that we're going to hold ourselves accountable to being at all times, so that anyone in the group, all the AEs, all the ASMs, they can call any one of us on these things at all times, because this is something that we've all committed to.
Thanks, Nick. From you all, whether it's at GitLab or in other experiences, I'm curious of, where you have observed maybe a lack of trust. What were the root causes that led to that?
The issue here is much with all the transparency, but it's usually a transparency issue.
Yeah, if I can add, I think one challenge we have here, I think I've met more than 60-70% of my team yet in person. So it's really challenging to not understand, one another in person, reading body language, what have you, and only being Zoom. So I think trust has a lot of, it implies, is there strong trust even before, starting on your journey, because you're just not able to meet in person. So hopefully, post pandemic, we'll be able to reconnect and establish that kind of connective tissue.
Yeah, I was going to say, my experiences I've seen in past teams, not necessarily GitLab, but past teams where there's a lot of conflict, and it becomes like a us versus them. And ultimately, what it came down to is the same thing that David was mentioning. They you didn't actually know them, you didn't trust them, you kind of never really spent any time with them. It's kind of like flying through, and there's always, you never give them the opportunity of like thinking that they're doing it with a positive intent, and it ends up becoming like, you never actually extend empathy to understand what they're trying to accomplish and try to put yourself through their lens. And once you got to get them together and break bread and realize, oh, they're just coming from a slightly different view, things got materially better. Part of it was just getting the team together for a little bit of team building activities.
I think a great example is in New Orleans, where Jack and I, we've met a couple of times, but spending some time together, especially at the casino, and building bond there, building that trust, helps.
David, this is recorded, by the way.
I had a situation at a previous company I worked at where leadership communicated a lot of the same values that GitLab does, but they did a poor job of demonstrating safety. And so they wanted transparency, they wanted people to be raising problems, they constantly encouraged that, but people were still a little bit afraid. They were afraid that they'd be called out for not doing something the right way. There was a lot of times where positive intent wasn't always granted, or assumption of positive intent. And some people could see that, yeah, speaking up is going to make the company better. And as long as you have your stuff in order, you can speak up. But the people whose groups maybe weren't fully in order felt a lot less safe to speak up. So I think you have to really demonstrate and prove safety rather than talking about it.
Yeah, great point, Patrick. That was a theme in the earlier session as well, is like, yeah, you got to be consistent, right? And show that over time. What another theme that we talked about in the earlier session was the notion, the transition from stage 3 to stage 4. So going from clarifying the goals to then committing to it. So I'm curious how you all approach this, right? On one end of the pendulum, there's here are the goals and this is how we're going to do it, and kind of that, directive dictatorial style. And then all the way to the other end of the pendulum is, attempting to get everybody to have unanimous support and consensus around how we're going to do it. Right. And both of those extremes, right, can be problem areas. How do you approach that of, yes, encouraging dissent and different perspectives, but at the same time, moving to commitment?
My perspective will be specific to sales. There are these moments where we've defined the goal. We all have to go make a lot of sales calls and close a lot of new revenue and land a bunch of new logos. But it's how we will do it. And I'm looking at slide 9, where we talked about what is unresolved when we enter into the commitment phase and what is resolved as we exit I'm thinking about nothing really sort of bolsters the crowd and the formation of a team, at least in sales, until we define sales territories. And I know that may sound very, very specific, but two people who share an area might sort of be cheering for each other, but as soon as we sort of split the area code down left, West Denver and East Denver, all of a sudden that role definition is so super important, especially in sales, because now when she does something well, I cheer, and when he does something well, I cheer. And I think that's all around just allowing them to start to depend on each other, that they're going to each take care of their own part. I think that's where the jobs start to get really granular and we start to assign that work.
So to play that back, so it's hard to go from 3 to 4 if you don't have that role clarity and some of those boundaries, like where it's blurred, then you might not have, you might question people's motives or things like that.
Yeah, perfect, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
I like to also acknowledge the white space. So when you're defining what everybody's role is, talk about what isn't yet defined and acknowledge it and say that's our shared responsibility. So if you see a gap, if you see something that's not your role, but then you look at the other group or the other person and you also see it's not their role, that's the white space, that's our shared responsibility to figure out, bring it up and work with those people to figure out what we can do about it.
Cool. I'd shared this earlier session, but I know I've made mistakes earlier of, I'm definitely not the dictatorial type. I probably err too much on the side of wanting to get consensus, right? And earlier on, like desiring all right, I want everybody to be bought in and agreed to it. But I've learned no, my role is to facilitate that healthy debate. Let's talk about objectively, what are the pros and the cons of different options. But at some point, making a decision, right, and not waiting too long, but making a decision, moving forward, and being and making it clear that hey, be transparent that this is the process we're going to follow. A decision will be made. We're going to do it. It may be the wrong decision, but you can iterate. And right, and it actually be more harmful to keep waiting and delaying making a decision and taking some kind of action versus just doing something, failing fast, learning it from it and iterating.
David, I would say every time I feel like as a leader, I make it from 3 to 4, 5, and I'm starting to feel that trajectory and I'm heading toward the sunshine of 6. Something changes within the team, and it's typically people or personnel. It's not a mission shift. I can generally adapt to those. It's everything's humming along, and all of a sudden you get an unexpected resignation. And so all of a sudden you look at it and you think, well, that doesn't put me back to 4, but I kind of need to because I want to bring that new team member along. And so for me, that Bermuda Triangle is kind of a real thing.
That makes sense. Thank you. That's actually a perfect lead into the next breakout